Now. Would the members of the audience, if you are able, we would ask you normally to please rise for the arrival of Her Honor. I'll ask you to sit, actually, because unfortunately this evening Her Honor will not be able to attend, and that is because she is not feeling well and felt the best thing to do would be to ensure that she is not here and unfortunately not wanting to spread any germs or anything of that nature. So Her Honor will not be attending, but I suspect she's watching in a live stream manner with us this evening. I do want to begin the evening by inviting somebody who's a highly respected leader in our community, somebody I have a lot of respect for, and that person is Elder Nepanak, to come forward with the blessing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. First of all, I want to remind people that we are on Treaty 1 territory, the land of my ancestors, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, the Inuit people, homeland of the Métis. And it is my right as an Indigenous person to welcome each and every one of you, the settlers, and also their ancestors. That is my rightful place to do that. I pray in my language. I grew up in a family of 9 girls, 2 brothers. And my mother always taught us to pray in our language, the language we knew best. It's in Anishinaabe. But in my prayer, I ask for strength and guidance for everyone. But I never forget about the people, the homeless people, children that are in care, people that have addictions. I pray for that they reach that good life. We call it bimatisiwin. But most importantly, to encourage that we all accept each other and to treat each other with kindness. My late husband would always say to me, please be kind to people because kindness goes a long way, and to be gentle with people, to use our words carefully, the way we react to people that are different from us. So I always remember that. The proper protocol for me is I have been given tobacco to do the prayer. We have 4 sacred medicines. I've been given tobacco so that I can do the prayer. My traditional name in my language is Nijobine, which means two Thunbird woman, and I am from the Bear Clan. And when we pray in our own traditional way, that's how we start. But I will pray for each and every one of you and your families. Nijobine sikwe de umakondotem. Mena maari mijine na mawana sema. Chimigagi suma kishemanitu. Chishaweni miguang. Kegawi kachawani kan gatonik, wokitine makarinanik, misega shakushinwat. Abino chiga kadawani mimp. Ambehe ongoe kapatakota swat, kamini koyat kebu. Madashino the Shinjipagosendan. Chimino Bimatis gave in our short the Sabandamuat. Ambengo Wabishke, my koyokin in Yokan Patapiot. Kevin, which can't what, Umagawi, Gigi to what way. But the Shane go mesh bago send the man. Sadagato manga was saying no go making, quick Chichigan Normandy. They ban quaking tyke to go to Moshe, each Anishina better in Igani. No go you have done ye. No go you have Maki Koyok in New York. Nigani yacht. Me Anishmaga in Jisungisian. Mekogan take it what. No go. Get to you avant a man. But the Shannon go measure back was sent a man. She shall win a meg one shamanito. Minoha he get to when she mean going. Chisahitian. Me go to no go measure back was sent a man. Me question the get no gishuk. Thank you very much for being here today. I embrace each and every one of you. I hope you enjoy the presentation for this evening.
Thank you very much, Elder Nepanak, both for the prayer and for all the work you do in our community. It's something I can go on for a long time about what you are doing to contribute here in Winnipeg. Well, as mentioned, at this point of time, we would normally bring Her Honor up. Regrettably, she is not going to be here, but we do have the pleasure of introducing her Chief of Staff, who will come and bring forward her greetings, the greetings from Her Honor. And so at this time, I do invite the Chief of Staff, Kate Gamero.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out in this lovely Winnipeg spring evening. Her Honor was so upset that she couldn't be here tonight, but she knew absolutely it was the right thing to do. So it's my absolute honor and privilege to bring greetings tonight on her behalf. Welcome to Manitoba, to Manitoba's Government House and our Reconciliation Through Education speaker series. To those of you who have been here before, many familiar faces, we welcome you back. Those who are attending for the first time, thank you for coming out to learn, to listen, and to share about this issue that is so important to our province and our country. Now I'm going to do what Her Honor always does so I can report back to her because I know she'll ask. How many of you are actually here for the first time this evening? Wonderful. Well, welcome. We hope that you will little plug, sign up online and receive all the notifications of some of the other wonderful events we do in the house here as well. Welcome to you all. Tonight, we are meeting in the heart of Treaty 1 territory in the capital of a province that is the ancestral and present-day home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Inuit, and Red River Métis peoples. And as we gather here today in Government House, we recognize and honor the importance of working together toward advancing understanding, healing, and reconciliation so that we can build a better home for all. Our wonderful partnership with our friends from the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation will, throughout this 9-part series, provide an invaluable resource to all of us into the history surrounding residential schools. Though these conversations are not always easy ones to have, they are so very important. They provide us with a pathway forward and encourage us to reflect, to ask questions, and they have promoted a desire to learn from our country's past and do better. So far in this series, we've explored the history of Canada's residential schools and the impacts of unconscious bias and stereotypes. Tonight, we welcome back our friend Kaila Johnston, the Director of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming at NCTR. Tonight, Kaila's topic, which won't come as a surprise, will focus on the legal fallout of the residential school system. The sharing of experience and insights by speakers in this series are intended to help us all find a better way to the future. On behalf of Lieutenant Governor Anita Neville, I thank each and every one of you for expressing your commitment to learning and to facilitating healing by coming out tonight. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
There we go. Lovely to see so many people out, especially with the uncontrollable weather. I know there was flooding and hail and rain. Hopefully no cats and dogs. I am very happy to be back to continue the conversation or the discussion that I started 2 months ago now, which was kind of laying the foundations on what was the residential school system. And upcoming, you're going to be learning about the impacts of the residential school system. So what we're looking at today is the legal fallout of the residential school system, focusing on the TRC and NCTR. But there's quite a lot of content to get there before we actually get to talk about the TRC and NCTR. So we'll see how far we get. I always have more content than time. But with that, I won't keep us too long that we miss out on the snacks and drinks at the end of the night and make sure everyone gets home at an appropriate time. But for those who didn't get to attend, I would like to state that all of the videos can be found on the NCTR's YouTube page for future access. And for those who got to attend the first session, this first part may be a little bit of a repetition. It's just a little information about who I am and where I'm coming from. So, as mentioned, I'm the Director of Education at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And I'm also an intergenerational survivor. So, my mother attended residential school, as did her siblings, parents, grandparents, and extended family. And the collage of the 4 schools you see on screen are the schools connected to my family's history. 3 are in the Qu'Appelle Valley, which are the Maryville, Round Lake, and Qu'Appelle schools, and one's located in Alberta known as Crowfoot. Now, in addition to growing up hearing some of those stories and experiences from my mother and what was passed on to her, I also worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. In fact, you could say that was one of my first adult jobs, was working for the Truth Commission. So the group photo you see here is of our statement gatherers, which I was one of, our senior archivists and statement gathering personnel. I was one of the first 25 trained through the TRC to take statements. And out of that, only 2 of us made it through the full commission for a variety of reasons, but one of the biggest was vicarious trauma and the trauma that exists hearing, listening, experiencing other people's traumatic stories. And so with that, I did want to highlight some health support. For immediate emotional support, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there is the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, as well as the Indian Residential Schools Survivors Crisis Line. There is the Hope for Wellness Helpline, which also has an online chat, and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Crisis Line. Finally, there's the new 988 Suicide Crisis Line, and then the Wellness Together Canada Crisis Line, which has lines for both adults as well as youth that can be telephone or by text. Now with that, let's get started in the content. So the first thing I wanted to actually touch upon before we even get to the TRC and CTR is a list of some of the apologies that were given. Up on screen, I have a list of 18. The first one I wanted to talk about is the one that came in 1986 from the United Church. And this was spurred on by an activist named Alberta Billy, who went to the United Church Council in 1981 asking for, or I should say demanding, an apology for the violent nature of the missionary work that the United Church engaged in. And so actually that's what the apology is about. So you see there's a second United Church listed, the one for 1998, and that is the official apology given for the residential school system and the United Church's role there. But you see there are a number of different organizations and institutions that have offered apologies, from the churches to the federal government and government offices like Indian and Northern Affairs and the RCMP. But we also have the premiers as well, the Premier of Alberta and Ontario, and you can also see a unique one on there in 2011. Then President of the University of Manitoba also offered an apology. And as far as I'm aware, that it's the only apology offered by a educational institution for its role in supporting, or I should say, providing teachers to the system. The most recent one I do have here listed is the apology given in 2022 from Pope Francis in the community of Mascouches. And so when it comes to apologies, there is a whole range or gamut of responses from communities on how they perceive apologies. Some survivors have expressed acceptance and appreciation, and others have taken another stance. Some have outright rejected apologies. One of my favorite responses that I wanted to share was actually connected, or is actually connected, to the Anglican Church elders. They received an apology in 2019 for the spiritual harm from the Anglican Church. And so what they said is they could not accept the apology on behalf of all Indigenous nations. They hoped that apology, however, could provide comfort and help convey God's grace and live. They couldn't speak for those who've been harmed. It was up to each and every person to consider the words of that apology and decide whether or not they were to forgive or not for themselves. The statement from Elder Grace Delaney was, "Each nation can now be true to the way Creator or God intended and fulfill their true destiny. They do not have to choose between their God and their culture. Those who are impacted by the actions of the church do not have to live separate lives from their faith to their ancestry or cultural practices. It's now accepted in the church." And I think that is a very poignant means of taking a look at apologies today. But I did want to highlight the 2011 apology from then President David Barnard, which was given at one of the TRC's national events in Halifax. He stated, "Our institution failed to recognize or challenge the forced assimilation of Aboriginal peoples and the subsequent loss of their language, culture, and traditions. That was a grave mistake, and it is our responsibility. We are sorry." And with that, the Vice President Indigenous position was established in October of 2019, and Dr. Catherine Cook was appointed in that role beginning in 2020. We now have a new VP Indigenous, Angie Bruce, and the creation of a reconciliation roadmap and plans extended through training and education of staff, including the Honorable Marie Sinclair joining the NCTR and the law faculty at that time in support of NCTR activities. Now, this gives me a little bit of a lead up to the settlement agreement. So when it comes to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, really we wouldn't be here today where we are without those survivors. They are the ones who are stepping forward, talking about their experiences within the residential school system and their impacts. It's through the 80s and 90s that we start to see apologies given by these institutions, but also exploratory dialogues on how to address it. In 1990, then Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Phil Fontaine, spoke about his experience at the Fort Alexander School on national television. He reported on a meeting with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of St. Boniface, in which he described the widespread abuse that occurred in these schools and demanded that thorough inquiry. And so government representatives, church officials, Indigenous organizations, as well as survivors, began to engage in those dialogues to develop principles for the resolution of the increasing claims outside of litigation. So in 2001, there were over 8,500 lawsuits filed, and just 4 years later, that number jumped to between 18 and 20,000 lawsuits, with 12 class action lawsuits as well. At that time, the Assembly of Chiefs had done a report which basically outlined what the cost was going to be to the Canadian federal government if they did not address the increasing litigation. And so in 2005, we had the Blackwater versus Pliant Supreme Court case, which ruled in favor of the Blackwater plaintiffs. And that sought acknowledgement of and compensation for the abuses committed within a specific BC residential school. So the Supreme Court ruled in the favor of those plaintiffs and set a precedent for those to come. And you can imagine at that time, if all survivors alive in 2005 decided to pursue legal action, it would bankrupt our country, put a complete freeze onto the court system, which made a settlement agreement seem like a very useful and supportive option. So when it comes to the settlement agreement, and this is where I play with my notes. Last time I didn't have my notes handy, and now I have too many. So in May of 2005, the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations signed a political agreement with the goals of achieving a court-sanctioned global resolution to all of that outstanding litigation. And a year later, in 2006, those negotiations were approved between the advisors for survivors, the churches, the Assembly of First Nations, as well as the government and other organizations to implement the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, also known as the Settlement Agreement, or IRSA. Now, this agreement states that the harms and abuses were committed against many children who attended residential schools and was formed to establish a fair, comprehensive, and lasting resolution to the legacy of the residential school system, in addition to promoting healing, education, commemoration, truth, and reconciliation. There was a 6-month opt-out period, and after that time, the agreement came into effect on September 19th of 2007. Now up on screen, I have just put a pictorial representation or a graph representation to the different components or parts of the settlement agreement. Two are compensation-based, the common experience payment, and the independent assessment process. And I'll let you know I'll be covering all these different pieces. But there was also funds set aside for healing, as well as funds for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. There was funds set aside for commemoration, the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and as you can see, branching off of that, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. So the first piece I wanted to touch upon was related to healing. Health Canada provides mental health and emotional supports through what's known as the Resolution Health Support Program, and they are also supporting the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, that 24-hour toll-free support service operated by trained crisis counselors and is still operating today. When it comes to the Resolution Support Program, this is also a program that still exists today. It provides mental health, emotional, and cultural support services to former students, their family, throughout all phases of the settlement agreement, from those compensation-based pieces to the TRC and commemoration activities. All former students are eligible to receive these services. In recognition as well of the intergenerational impacts, services are also provided to family members, such as their spouse or partner, their children, or those who have been raised or lived in that house. Really, any relation that has experienced the effects of intergenerational trauma associated with the residential school system is able to access those resources. I also mentioned there was funds set aside for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. The settlement agreement provided $125 million to the Healing Foundation for community-based initiatives in order to promote reconciliation and support Indigenous peoples in building a sustainable healing process, as well as address any relevant issues pertaining to that legacy of the residential school system. After those funds were distributed to community-based organizations, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation closed its doors. However, they released a number of really interesting and seminal reports based upon the work that they had done, all of which you can access on our database in the reports section. Now, the next piece I wanted to touch upon is commemoration. There was $20 million set aside for 6 years for 144 initiatives to pay tribute, honor, educate, remember those experiences of those former students. This also includes the stained glass window installed in Parliament, which I'll talk more about in a few slides. Commemoration was managed jointly by Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, the main objectives of commemoration were to assist in honoring and validating the healing and reconciliation of former students and their families through initiatives that address that experience. It was also to provide support towards efforts of improving and enhancing Indigenous relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It was to contribute to a sense of identity, unity, and belonging, to promote Indigenous languages, cultures, traditions, and spiritual values, ensure that that legacy of the residential school system and former students and families, that their experiences and needs are affirmed, as well as to memorialize in a tangible and permanent way that residential school experience. So one such initiative was is the stained glass window. So the stained glass window in the center block of Parliament commemorates the legacy of former residential school students and their families, as well as the Prime Minister's apology given in 2008. A 5-member selection committee comprised of Indigenous art experts and former residential school students with representation for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples were established to oversee this process. The design selected was from Christy Belcourt, a Métis artist. The window was installed directly above the west door of the central block in October and presented to the Speaker of the House in November of 2012 in a dedication ceremony on Parliament Hill. This brings us to the compensation-based components. So the first piece I wanted to talk about is the CEP, or Common Experience Payment. The Common Experience Payment was a lump sum payment provided to survivors of the residential school system for the loss of culture, family, and assimilation. Claimants were eligible to receive $10,000 for a first or partial year they could prove they were at residential school, and an additional $3,000 for each year thereafter. Now, the deadline to apply was September of 2011, with exceptional cases given a one-year extension. And there were over 79,000 applicants paid out, with about 23,000 deemed ineligible. The average payment was about $20,000, with $1.6 billion paid out in compensation. The one component I have to highlight, or a few components, is with the Common Experience Payment, you had to be residing at the residential school. If you were a day school student, you could not access the funds of the Common Experience Payment. In addition to that, you heard me say they had to prove they were at the residential school. You can imagine a little difficulty was experienced for those whose records were lost or destroyed for a variety of reasons. Now, the other compensation-based piece I wanted to talk about is the independent assessment process, or the IAP. The IAP provided non-adversarial out-of-court process for the resolution of claims of sexual abuse and physical abuse, as well as other wrongful acts, with an accumulating point-based system on degrees of harm. Now, if you think that sounds arbitrary, it is arbitrary. That's one of the main complaints. How do we actually quantify the amount of harm someone experiences in order to provide a certain amount of compensation to them for that harm they experienced? Now, for the IEP, there were over 38,000 claims filed. There were 26,000 hearings held, and $3.2 billion worth of compensation awarded, with the average payment being about $113,000. The deadline to apply, just like the Common Experience Payment, was in 2011 with the extenuating circumstances given, but there was a much longer shelf life for the IAP compared to the CEP. Now, up on screen, I have a table which shows you a breakdown as to the number of applicants per province, as well as outside of Canada, with Manitoba having 5,492 applying for the IAP, with the highest actually falling in Saskatchewan, with 8,897. Now, the Adjudication Secretariat was actually the organization responsible for the operation and administration of the IAP. It provided information on the process, assessed the eligibility of claims, provided the support for claimants, scheduled and made arrangements for the hearings, managed the program, and measured and reported the performance of the IAP. So you can actually visit their website today and download their report, which goes through all of this in detail, and actually much more than what I'm able to present on today. When it comes to the objectives of the IAP, the main focus was to resolve that litigation by providing financial compensation for those who suffered abuse, consolidate and finalize civil legal actions, and ensure claims were subject to validation processes. It was also there to provide a reconciliation process, provide a claimant-centered process, provide outreach by ensuring all members of the class action were notified about the agreement, and that they would complete objectives as a process of at least 2,500 claims per year. Claims were to be offered a hearing date within 9 months of their application, with claims being processed with 1 year of the IEP deadline. Adjudicators were to provide a written decision within 30 days of the hearing, and fees charged by counsel could be subject to review of the adjudicator. Now, one piece I always like to talk about when it comes to the IAP is a little bit of a controversial one, and that's related to the destruction of records. I will preface this by saying all records held by the NCTR, whether it's government documents, church documents, or survivor statements and physical objects, are held and protected in perpetuity, so long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines. The same, however, cannot be said for the IAP documents. A major challenge to ensuring truth comes before reconciliation is the destruction of records. Now, in 2014, the question about whether or not the IEP record should be saved or destroyed was debated, as information was not adequately provided to claimants. Some were told their records would be saved, others were told their records would be destroyed. The fight to save or destroy records existed between the TRC, NCTR, and Library and Archives Canada, who believed the records should be kept, while the chief adjudicator of the compensation process and 24 Catholic Church entities argued they should be destroyed. In 2017, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the order of the Ontario Superior Court judge that the IP records will be destroyed to protect the confidentiality of claimants and perpetrators. The IP records include the application, decision, audio transcript of the adjudication, and the adjudication process, all of which will be destroyed September 19th, 2027. Now, because the NCTR and TRC were involved in the court case, unfortunately, we were not allowed to participate in the notification process. That was to be led by the IEP Secretariat. And so there is a website you can still visit today where survivors can request a copy of their records. They can request that a copy be sent to the NCTR or both. And they also can do nothing. If they do nothing, they can ensure that those records will be destroyed. Now, unfortunately, only the survivor themselves can make the decision to get a copy of their records. Their family cannot make that request on their behalf. Hence, the name of the program, My Records, My Choice. Now, the reason why this is tentatively so detrimental is for the fact that during the TRC's mandate, they collected statements from about 7,000 individuals. And as I already shared, there are about 38,000 applications to the IAP. Now, why was there such a stark difference? Well, while both processes were dedicated to gathering the truth, while both were voluntary, the TRC could not offer compensation to anyone who came and shared their story or experience with them. They can only receive that from the IEP process. The TRC was also a much shorter duration, 5 years plus a 1-year extension, 6 years in total, compared to the IEP, which lasted from 2007 until 2020, over 10 years. Now, while both of those processes were related to statement gathering, they for vastly different purposes and are considered records of the truth, records of experiences. Now, all truth is part of that path towards reconciliation. And if I had a fancier version of my PowerPoint, I'd jump back to the graphics I showed earlier. If you remember, at the center was the IRSSA, the settlement agreement, and each component was like its little circle branching off. And that is because they were siloed. The commissioners of the TRC could not influence what was happening at the CEP. Likewise, the director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation couldn't influence the commissioners of the TRC or influence what was happening at the IAP. So information was not shared amongst those different silos, which is why we are here today with this challenge, which is connected to, can we save the records? Another aspect that has come up in the initial decision, which was not considered, and that was the children who died or who went missing. Kimberly Murray, the independent special interlocutor for the Office of Missing Children and Unmarked Burials, have made calls to re-examine the IEP records for information that might assist them in the work being done around missing children. Presently, out of 38,000 files, the NCTR has 27 of them. And there are a number of reasons for this. Now, for Geraldine Shingus, a survivor and elder, she is actually one of those 27. In a recent article published by the CBC, she said her heart was broken to think of thousands of records that would be destroyed unless more survivors are able to make that request. She said, that's history. Those are sacred stories. Shingus applied for her records in 2019 and actually provided a copy of those records to the NCTR and kept one for herself in order to pass on to her children and great-grandchildren. It was a way of ensuring that the most detailed account of her experience was not forgotten. She said, I wanted to share my truth. I want my truth, my story, to be shared. And although we cannot ask residential school survivors to provide those documents to us, it is important that they know that they still have that opportunity to get those records for themselves at the very least, because once they are gone, they are gone. And unfortunately, we live in a time of residential school denialism, as well as genocide denialism, and oftentimes the same arguments I hear connected to genocide denial and residential school denial are the same, which is show us the evidence. Show us human remains, show us, in this case, the documents of those who have been abused. And unfortunately, those are the documents at risk for destruction. Now, I also briefly wanted to talk about a report that was released in 2023. The Standing Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples released a report entitled Honoring the Children Who Never Came Home, Truth, Education, and Reconciliation. Now, this report offers 6 recommendations to support the NCTR, as well as the Office of the Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. Mainly, it urged the federal government to expedite the transfer of all federal records to the NCTR, ensure our funding, as well as support the Special Interlocutor's Office in combat residential school denialism. The committee named Library and Archives Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, provincial and territorial governments, and 8 Roman Catholic religious bodies for those who still have outstanding records. The committee has pledged to hold hearings in the fall, which were held, to demand answers from organizations who have not yet released those records. Now, this is in connection to a number of the calls to action which are geared towards our center. So I'll talk a little bit about those calls to action. First one being number 72, to develop a national residential school register. Now, in 2022, the archives hired Wampum Records and CDCI Inc. to continue research into records to identify children who died. The work will be completed in 2023 and will flow into the next phase of the work to notify families for further investigation, which is then closely linked to calls to action 73 to 76, which are related to establishing an online register for cemeteries, informing families of children's reburials locations or determine commemoration ceremonies. It's also to identify, protect, and maintain cemeteries, and to commit to Indigenous principles and protocols. So in 2022, the archive drafted a proposal to the federal government to work on call to action number 73 to 76, with the expected start date of the next phase upcoming. Now, all this work has been underway to help facilitate families and communities to research and do commemoration-based work. The archive works very closely with communities needing access to records to help inform their burial research, including the development of more than a dozen agreements for fuller access to the records in our collection. We are now entering phase 3 of the Missing Children's Project, which is then closely connected to 2 records as well. So number 77 is related to the NCTR's collection of records. Now, in 2021, over 1 million documents were received from Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, as well as copies of schools' narratives used in the settlement agreement. The Centre has continued negotiations to acquire reports used for the independent assessment process to provide information to survivors who participated. An agreement has been drafted with the Oblates to give reference copies of all their records to the NCTR and to make the NCTR the principal repository of reference for all research into the history of the Oblates, the OMI Lacombe, and the residential school system in Canada. Negotiations are also being finalized to acquire records connected to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the records of the Common Experience Payment, as well as federal day school records. Now, in 2023, former Chief Cadamus DeLorme was appointed as chairperson of the Residential School Document Advisory Committee. This committee was established to develop recommendations to identify and share documents with the NCTR. Through an initial review, we've identified approximately 23 million documents that were not released to the NCTR, in addition to 1.5 million documents and images that had already been provided. The committee will be providing recommendations to the Government of Canada on removing barriers to sharing those documents while respecting survivor and family wishes, legislation, court orders, settlement agreements, and ongoing litigation processes. Now, one of the top priorities is to ensure stakeholder views, that is, those of Indigenous nations, communities, and survivors, are reflected in the decisions regarding the important work of identifying the review of and recommendations of sharing those documents. Now, this brings us to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And looking at the time, I think I actually am on time. So on June 1st of 2008, the TRC was founded as a holistic and comprehensive response to the Indian residential school system and a sincere acknowledgement of the injustices and harms caused. It's the first court-ordered truth commission of its kind established in Canada, and as I already shared, the courts continued to play a part in the process even after the TRC closed its doors. There were 3 commissioners appointed in 2008, however, they resigned within the year after being appointed. 3 new commissioners were appointed a year later by the members or the parties of the settlement agreement, which are the 3 you see on screen. The Honorable Marie Sinclair, Dr. Marie Wilson, and Chief Wilton Littlechild. They were appointed in June of 2009 and had 1 year to plan the first national event held here in Winnipeg in 2010. Now, when it comes to the work of the TRC, the Commission had the responsibility to tell Canadians what happened in the residential school system. They also had the responsibility to honor the lives of former students and their family, as well as create a permanent record of the residential school system's legacy. Now, the TRC was allocated $60 million over 5 years, plus that 1-year extension, to document those histories of survivors, families, and communities, and anyone who had been impacted by the residential school system. It's important for me to state that the TRC collected experiences not only from former students, but from anyone who had something to share about the residential school system, whether they themselves or others had been impacted. Providing experiences to the TRC was a voluntary process, with statement providers encouraged to share about any aspect of their lives, direct experiences as a student, a relative, or someone who worked in the schools, a friend or neighbor. Now, the health and safety of statement providers was paramount. Health support was provided before, during, and after the statement gathering process, and providers were also welcome to bring extra support with them. Now, to aid in the work of the TRC, Health Canada was giving funding to ensure all former students and their families had access to that assistance through the Resolution Health Support Program. Now, when it comes to the goals of the TRC, there were 6 of them. The first is to acknowledge the experiences, impacts, and consequences of the residential school system. The second was providing a holistic and culturally appropriate and safe setting for students, former students, families, and communities to come forward. The next was to provide witness support, promote and facilitate truth reconciliation at events such as the national and community-based gatherings. Oh, look at that, I was wrong, there were 7 of them. The next is to promote awareness and public education of the Canadian residential school system and its impacts. The fourth, identify sources, or I should say the fifth, identify sources and create a complete and historical record as possible. Those records should be preserved and made accessible for future use. The sixth, produce and submit a report including recommendations concerning residential schools and the experience of the history, purpose, operation, facilitation, effect, and consequences of the legacy. And finally, to support commemoration of former students and their families in accordance with the Commemoration Policy Directive. Now up on screen I have another little image here which contained the 8 components of the TRC's mandate. I talked a little bit already about commemoration. Those consisted of $50,000 grants to honor, educate, remember, and pay tribute to former students and families and communities. There was also 7 regional liaison offices across Canada to coordinate TRC initiatives. There was the founding of the Missing Children and Unmarked Burial Project to identify the names of and information about the children who died at residential school. Presently, if you visit our online database, we have listed in our named and unnamed register 4,139 confirmed deaths. Now, I was recently informed by our Director of Archives and Research that we have 19,000 records documenting loss. Not necessarily each one a unique loss, but 19,000 records at the very least talking about it, with about 400,000 more records for us to go through from the original TRC collection before even getting the 23 million new records to come in. There was also funds set aside for community-based events, $10,000 grants for communities to respond to the needs of those who were impacted by the residential school system. There were 7 national events held across Canada to promote awareness and public education. They were held in Winnipeg, Inuvik, Halifax, Saskatoon, Montreal, Vancouver, and Edmonton, followed by closing ceremonies in Ottawa in 2015. There was also the statement gathering process, which involved gathering audio, video, written statements from survivors, as well as document collection, which was to inform the creation of an accurate and public historical record. And finally, statement gathering, document collection, all accumulated in the TRC's final report. Now, they say it's 6 volumes. It's actually 10 books in length, over 4,000 pages of reading material, all of which you can access on our website. In English and French, it also has been indexed. But if that is a tall order, and sometimes reading can be a tall order, we have a nice abridged version called A Knock on the Door that you can get from U of M Press, also available by audiobook. Now, as for the statement gathering process, as I shared as a statement gatherer, I'm going to share a little bit about those experiences. Well, for public statements, an individual could participate in a sharing circle with other survivors with them. This was done in the presence of others. It was recorded for the archives. In that case, sometimes they did not take names, and they were allotted 15 to 20 minutes per person. These are some of the videos that you can currently find on our archive. You can also find on our public database the sharing panels. Well, that was the opportunity for survivors to speak to 1 or up to 3 commissioners, also done in the presence of others. It was recorded and broadcast online with 15 to 20 minutes per person. But I can tell you we have statements 40 minutes or longer for some individuals, and those videos can also be accessed through our online database. But in addition to these public statements, there was also private statements taken. So there were one-on-one private statements taken, which provided the statement provider the opportunity to share as much as they wanted. So we have statements 5 minutes in length to over 10 hours in length. Statements from one individual to whole families and sharing circles together. We have statements in English and French and in a number of Indigenous languages. In that case, those statements also will eventually be uploaded to our online database, but due to privacy concerns, those have not made it through the privacy and access team yet. Now, those present, there were also health support workers, both in the public and private setting, and individuals who decided to go through the one-on-one statement had the choice of being either anonymous or non-anonymous. Now, as I mentioned, there were no time limits, and individuals could take as much time as they needed in these one-on-one settings. And for these final little pieces, I wanted to just highlight what the TRC could do and what the TRC couldn't do. Now, the TRC, it could receive statements and documents from students, families, and communities, or other interested participants, and make use of those documents or materials. They could adopt informal processes or methods for events and activities, as long as they remained consistent with those 7 goals. However, the TRC could not hold formal hearings. It could not act as a public inquiry, nor conduct any formal legal processes. They did not have subpoena powers. They could not compel anyone to attend or participate in the process. In fact, one of its guiding principles was the voluntary nature of the program. They also could not duplicate in whole or in part the function of criminal investigations, the IAP or court actions, or make recommendations on matters that had already been covered in the URSA agreement. Now this leads us to the last section, which is all about the NCTR, or the organization I work for today. So when it comes to the founding of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, as one of our survivors likes to say, we are the baby of the TRC. Once they closed their doors, we opened ours. So as the permanent safe home for all of the statements, documents, and materials gathered by the TRC, we work with a network of partners and supporters to continue to expand that collection and promote ongoing research and learning. For instance, one of the next big topics we are discussing right now is how far do we expand our mandate? Mostly our focus has been on settlement agreement recognized schools, so 146 presently, through the URSA agreement, as well as an agreement for 5 schools in Newfoundland and Labrador. But there were over 1,500 institutions put forward for recognition. Only a drop in the bucket are formally recognized. There are a great number of unrecognized institutions solely run by religious institutions or by provincial or territorial governments, which go unrecognized today. And actually, if I have time at the very end, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I always like to share a couple of quotes. One of the quotes I usually like to share is this one by George Erasmus, shared in 2011 at the TRC National Research Center Forum. So the settlement agreement has a component attached to it or connected to it, knowing that the TRC had a finite end date. What was going to happen to everything collected? And so although they didn't know what it was going to look like, they built that in. So George Erasmus said, if the stories of our people are not accessible to the general public, it'll be as if those experiences never occurred. And if the voices are rendered as museum pieces, it will be as if that experience is frozen in time. What we need are open, dynamic, and interactive spaces and participatory forms of narrative, knowledge, and research. And that's a very fitting way to step into the 21st century and into a new kind of a relationship. Because primarily, as I mentioned, our main focus is as an archive, is to protect those materials. But when I say the word archive, I imagine some of the first images that come to your mind are Library and Archives Canada, or the Manitoba Archives or City Archives, where you physically have to go to that location to pull originals or microfilm reels. But what's unique about our collection is that 95% of our records have been digitized and are held on computer servers already, which makes it very easy for us to proactively release documents as we continue to march forward. Now, there's another quote I like to share by one of our Survivor Circle members, Eugene Arcand. For us as survivors, it's important that we see the NCTR as our home, where our truths, experiences, and lives are validated, honored, and never forgotten. The staff carry that responsibility, both today and tomorrow, to ensure our voices are carried forward in a good way. Now, when it comes to who works at the NCTR, well, we have a team comprised of a mix of survivors, intergenerational survivors, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, non-Indigenous, as well as newcomers. 70% of staff are Indigenous, with over 50% being women. And staff at the NCTR have gone on to work for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, the UBC Dialogue Center, in public service, as well as their home communities, just to name a few. As for the different areas of the NCTR, we have 3 main areas. We have archives, research, and that fun acronym EOPP, that's me. That's Education, Outreach, and Public Programming. For archives, they're there to accession or take in new documents. They are there to support research, to honor and safeguard that history, and provide access to records. For our research team, they're there to promote and advance research, support graduate and undergraduate studies, as well as establish and develop research relationships. Today, we just made an announcement regarding SHRC 6 reconciliation-based projects, which I believe you can now find on the news as well as our website. And lastly, in education, we're here to provide access to our resources, assist in the development of new resources, support for educators and students, engage the public on the history and legacy, and establish and develop new outreach initiatives. All right, now I see I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to jump a few slides here. When it comes to survivor and family access, that is paramount. The NCTR since 2017 has received over 1,932 survivor-specific requests and over 3,939 total requests, including survivors, media, research, and other interested parties. Now, a request can actually have multiple people. In fact, our largest file is of 14 siblings. It is important to recognize that people have a right to access their own information. Prior to the establishment of our center, individuals would have had to go to Library and Archives Canada, or the United Church Archives, or to Châtelet in Montreal to try and piece together all the locations where their records might be held. We are really that one-stop shop for survivors, families, and researchers, as well as the media, to get access to this information. So you may be wondering, well, how do I get access? Well, if you're a survivor, you can submit a survivor inquiry. Those records are your records. But if you're a third-party individual, if you're an intergenerational survivor or a researcher, that requires either the permission of the survivor, if they are still alive, or proof of death if that survivor is no longer with us. And all it takes is an email or a phone call or even downloading the form off our website to get that process started, and it's completely free of charge. We will provide all relevant records connected to that request for that individual. In some cases, it's quite a lot of material. In some cases, not so much. And it really just depends on what records survived. As for what's currently available, we have over 3 million records in our current holding. It's between 3 and 5 million, over 7,000 hours of audio-video footage, documents from 17 different government departments and 132 church entities. And if you visit our public database, you can get access to 67,000 items right now, over 39,000 documents, over 26,000 photographs, historical and contemporary, and over 1,200 videos, including those survivor statements from sharing circles and panels, but also special events videos and mini documentaries. So this is what the landing page of our database looks like. And that's the URL to access it. I always encourage people to visit that database because you never know what you're going to find in there. It's archives.nctr.ca. And as I mentioned, every year we are uploading new documents. In 2023, we uploaded over 4,700. And this year, we've uploaded something like 200 or 300 new records that haven't been released to date. Now I'm going to share a little bit more about our activities, more aligned with our education activities because that's my area. We get requests from educators, students, organizations, the public and private sector, and we provide presentations, everything from what is a residential school and what was that experience, which is our bread and butter. It is our expertise there, but also on closely related topics like the 60s scoop, the federal day school system, like the segregated medical care system we had in Canada, but also on intergenerational trauma, on resiliency and healing and truth-telling, but also reconciliation and engagement and allyship. We do anywhere from 2 to 3 presentations per week, over 150 per year. We do about 50 or so presentations in September, with over 200 engagements in 2022 and 176 in 2023, for a team of 2, now 3. But in addition to that, we also have a great number of international visitors. Starting in 2016, we had countries like Colombia, the Ivory Coast, the United States and Mali, Norway, Taiwan, East Timor, Germany, as well as, Taiwan once again, Ireland, Australia, and Brazil, and upcoming we have our Norwegian visitors visiting us again. And the main questions that many of these countries are looking to get answered is, what was the TRC? How did it operate? What happens after a Truth Commission ends? What happens to everything you collected? How do you ensure, once you establish a center, that the survivor voice remains present throughout all the work that you do? And so with that, that's what a lot of these institutions are looking for, is information to help guide their own processes back home. In fact, the Norwegian TRC recently released their report, and our governing circle chair, Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, visited the Sami Parliament to talk about the establishment of the NCTR and how Norway could potentially establish their own center dedicated to truth and reconciliation and the impacts of colonization on the Sami people. Recently, we had the president of the Brazilian Amnesty Commission visit us to talk about how they would like to establish something very similar back home in Brazil, given the atrocities that occurred in the colonization of Brazil and the ongoing atrocities that are currently occurring regarding expansion through deforestation of the Amazon and mining and, oh my goodness, and farming as well. And so a lot of groups are coming to us looking for that information, and that's information we are very happy to share. We also still do statement gathering activities. Since the Kamloops announcement in 2021 about the 200 unmarked burials at the former site of the Kamloops Residential School, survivors have now continued to come forward to talk about how they would now like to share their experience. During the TRC's mandate, many were not ready to talk about that experience, or many had determined they only had the strength at that time to tell their story or experience once, and so they told it to the IAP, and are now at a point in time in their healing journey where they're ready to talk about this. So when it comes to statement gathering, we're really there to ensure a safe space for the sharing and transfer of knowledge, whether it's creating that permanent record about that provider's experience, assisting in the research of missing children and unmarked burials, or being a witness to ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. At the NCTR, we welcome providers to talk about residential and federal day schools, the intergenerational experience, the 60s scoop, Indian hospitals and sanatoriums, but also colonialism and the Canadian government, the child welfare system, justice system or education system, Métis or Inuit-specific topics, or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now, it just so happens right now, I'm also in charge of statement gathering. So we are a small but mighty team, but these days, many communities are actually doing the work themselves. So a lot of the work now is actually capacity building in communities. We provide training and support to communities who are willing to engage or wishing to engage in statement gathering activities. And this includes, but is not limited to, access to the TRC and NCTR statement gathering guides, which are living documents that continue to grow and expand, virtual and in-person training, as well as a list of the equipment we use, as well as job shadowing for statement gatherers at events. I also want to talk a little bit about the Decolonizing Lens, which is actually one of my babies. It's one of the first programs I ever established at the NCTR. The Decolonizing Lens was founded in 2016 after an event held by the 4Rs where we discussed, you know, you can pay $20 or more to see a movie in theaters that isn't very good and that kind of wastes your time. And so the Decolonizing Lens is an opportunity to screen films by Indigenous filmmakers from Turtle Island and beyond, but in addition to that, feeding the audience and then bringing either the producer, the writer, the director, or other individuals involved in the production of that film to talk about that event. Since our establishment, we've had over 38 events, screened over 100 films, and had over 100 guests visit us, both from across Canada, but also internationally as well. We've worked with the National Film Board of Canada, the Gimme Some Truth Documentary Film Festival, the Windex Film Festival of Moving Images, the Appleton Charitable Foundation, CBC Short Docs, Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, and the Friends of Shoal Lake 40. So I also wanted to highlight an event that's happening tomorrow at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. The Decolonizing Lens, we are screening Lucy Tulagarchuk's film, Tuktutavuk, or What We See. And so that is at 7 p.m. for the screening, but we open the doors at 6:15 and we feed everybody. So we'll have a collection of foods available by Shelley's Bistro. And so you're welcome to come on down, but if you can't come in person, the great thing is we're hybrid. So you can actually watch the film from home. We have a Facebook event up if you would like to take a look at the event link, and that link is actually accessible all throughout the weekend. So it will be available until Sunday evening. Now, the last little pieces I wanted to talk about are our national education programs. In 2020, we established a single-day event called Every Child Matters: Reconciliation Through Education, where we had 500,000 students and educators join us. A year later, we expanded to a full week's worth of content and had 800,000 students and educators join us. That is also when we established our national broadcast for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, where last year we had over 2 million people join. Now, this year we have a week's worth of content available for students and educators from grades 1 to grade 12 from September 23rd to 27th. In addition to that, last year we launched a very popular adult education lunch and learn program. We screened, or I should say, we hosted 5 adult education lunch and learns at noon hour Central Time here on a variety of topics, everything from the deeper truths of residential school to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to exploring reconciliation. We had over 40,000 individuals join us, and we're happy to say that we are hosting at least five adult education lunch and learns this year as well, expanding on those topics first explored last year, and again, all of which you can access on our NCTR YouTube page. But in addition to that, you can access all of the previous year's content on the YouTube page that we released for those students and educators, as well as the Canada's History magazine. We've published 4 magazines so far, and we're entering our 5th version. These publications are designed to support teachers and students as their learning journey with complementary content and activities to encourage that inquisitivity and investigation. These publications are produced digitally as well as printed in English and French, which leads me to the live youth empowerment event. So I'm very happy that our elder, Barbara Nipanak, talked a little bit about Mino Pamatasawin. As it just so happens, that's this year's theme for our live youth empowerment event, as well as our student publication, Living the Good Life. It will be a 90-minute program, empowering event for 5,000 to 6,000 students in grades 8 to 12 here in Winnipeg at the Canada Life Centre. This program will occur on September 18th and will be live streamed and then cut for rebroadcast for our students on September 26th. And so in this program, we're going to be exploring what does Mino Pamatasawin, or living the good life, look like? What does it mean to live our most authentic selves? What does it mean to serve our communities as well as connect to the land? And so our students are going to be hearing from a number of speakers, from academics to activists to performers, as well as survivors through fireside chat on the importance of living the good life. 8:04. I think that means I just have a few minutes left. And so I'm going to end off on this last piece with this lessons learned exercise. So in 2018-2019, we engaged in the lessons learned exercise around the 5 components of the settlement agreement. We wanted to document the successes and challenges associated with its implementation, administration, and operation, what was missed, what could be addressed in the future, and give a report on that. It's, as I said, no secret that not all survivors and families were satisfied by the agreement. The creation of the report was to document that survivor experience, whether good or bad, and a way to inform the public about that experience with the agreement, how it impacted them, and potentially to hopefully influence future agreements. There were several lawsuits in the works regarding the federal day school system, the 60 Scoop, as well as the Indian hospitals, where information from this could help influence. And so there were a number of challenges that were highlighted. The ones that I had highlighted in bold: re-victimization and re-traumatization, the levels of compensation, the lack of adequate legal representation, were some of the biggest concerns brought up by survivors. Going through the CEP and IAP process sometimes led to that re-victimization, particularly when health support was not available over the long term, or where sports were not culturally appropriate. Survivors recounted stories of having legal counsel provided to them with inadequate guidance. Survivors also recounted having to pay their lawyers huge sums of legal fees, leaving them with little or no compensation, while others recorded having to do their own research on the records for residential schools, having legal counsel lose their files, and being accused by lawyers or others that they were lying about their stories. So when it comes to re-victimization, the triggering of survivors' post-traumatic stress disorder sometimes prevented them from giving statements during the adjudication process. Again, as I mentioned, others recounted that they were disbelieved by their lawyers or government officials involved in the process, or about the abuse they suffered. One case in particular stands out are the survivors of the St. Anne's Residential School located in Fort Albany, who talked about the use of an electric chair. However, compensation was not provided regarding the use of the electric chair because they were not believed. Lo and behold, unfortunately, the federal government was holding on to records that explicitly talked about the electric chair. And although those survivors won the court case, it was determined that they were not going to revisit the compensation that was provided to them. Another area of concern was that lack of adequate legal representation. Survivors recounted stories of having legal counsel provided to them, but with inadequate information. As I mentioned earlier, they also recounted having to pay large sums with little to no compensation being left, and others recounted having to do their own research. Now, there were a number of gaps as well around increased supports, including for intergenerational healing, language revitalization, economic security, and records. When it comes to the increased supports, government supports and support for elders is still needed today. Although the TRC, IEP, and CEP have concluded, the need for the Resolution Health Support Program is ever needed. Action on the TRC's calls to action cannot overshadow the continuing need to address unresolved intergenerational grief and continue in-person supports for intergenerational healing. Those supports should be culturally competent and community-based. This last little piece is related to legal proceedings. That is, they were wanting to ensure that future class action lawsuits, that there's a cap on the level of legal fees for counsel on what they can collect through class actions. Future efforts to address the resolution of the settlement agreement should not be adversarial in nature, but based on the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, ways of life, and ceremonies if true healing and reconciliation are to be achieved. Lastly, there's a need to ensure safe spaces to heal and receive treatment. Information should be provided in a respectful, understanding manner, and stories kept confidential, with future proceedings being non-legal in nature, as I mentioned earlier. Now, there were a number of solutions that were brought forward. The ones that I have in bold were the ones that were the most important or highlighted, which was the need for further public education and educational efforts, the need for commemoration, intergenerational healing, a revisit to the legal proceedings, an independent review, look at intergenerational impacts, the reestablishment of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and more funds for community-based healing efforts. I know I'm at my very end here, and I'm on my last couple of slides, but these last slides I'll just quickly show you. The settlement agreement was not the final piece. As I mentioned, there are a number of other settlement agreements, and so I have a few on screen. One is for the Federal Indian Day Schools class action settlement. There was also the establishment of the McLean Day School Settlement Corporation to administer legacy funds. I talked about the common experience payment earlier. There is a settlement agreement to address those who are unable to receive compensation through the CEP because they were day scholars of residential schools. All of which these have closed. Individuals are no longer able to apply. But there's also class action settlements taking a look at the Illala Cross School, which was originally excluded. The settlement agreement now moving forward is to take both the federal government and the province of Saskatchewan to court. This may actually open the door for the recognition of provincially run residential schools. There's the 60 Scoop class action settlement agreement, which unfortunately non-treaty status and Métis individuals could not participate in. The main point from the National Council was that they didn't have the records to establish or ensure that individuals could get compensation. So there is currently a 60 Scoop Métis and non-treaty status class action moving ahead. And then an Indian hospitals class action. Now, ones that I haven't pulled up is I've seen class actions connected to home placements, that is individuals who were boarded inside cities and attending public schools, as well as a potential class action related to forced sterilization. So really, the settlement agreement, the IRSA agreement, and survivors really kind of set the ground and foundation for us to explore some of these areas that have not really been talked about before. Thanks to the work they started in the 1980s, it's taken us decades to get to this point, and it's going to be many decades ahead for us to be able to address all of the outstanding challenges thanks to colonialism today. But with that, we are 12 minutes past the hour. I want to thank everyone for attending my presentation, from listening and learning about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the NCTR, but also the IRSA agreement and other closely connected topics. As mentioned, the next presentation is going to be provided by a resolution health support worker, Kathy, who is going to be talking about the intergenerational impacts of the residential school system. So with that, it looks like the rain has cleared up, which I'm hoping means smooth sailing going home for everybody. But I'll pass it back to the Government House to conclude today. Thank you.
Well, that was truly an amazing presentation. I can't thank you enough. Kaila, I think I speak for the crowd when I say that. So much information in that, and really we challenged you with a short time frame to present so much, and it was so valuable. I really enjoyed the quote from George Erasmus, which talked about the remembering of stories, the telling of stories, the capturing of that history, and that's what Kaila and her team are doing. And you've done that here tonight and sharing some of that with us, and we're very thankful. We never want to leave without the opportunity to extend the Q&A part to the crowd in-house. So I do want to give that opportunity. I know we're a little short on time, but I think people here will appreciate that opportunity if you want. So by show of hands, perhaps do put your hand up. And I know that you can probably project, but one of my fellow aides is going to come by with a microphone so that we all hear your question. And thank you for putting your hand up, and we'll get the microphone to you for that question.
Oh, two back.
There's a couple there.
Thank you very much. That was an impressive amount of information. You gave us so many numbers, and the ones that stick in my mind are the fractions of the people affected, right? So 79,280 applicants, right? The known 4,139 kids who never came home. Do we know how many children attended all the residential schools for the years that they operated, or even have an estimate?
There is an estimate regarding the recognized schools, which is 150,000, but that really does not speak to the unrecognized schools I talked about earlier. There's also a stat regarding the federal day schools. Unfortunately, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but those ran as late as the year 2000, and I think that one is maybe 200,000 having attended the federal day schools. So I don't think there's been stats or really anything connected to the unrecognized schools and what that greater number might be.
I'm wondering, with the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation, the material you covered tonight certainly gave us a good idea of how the center is helping the Indigenous people deal with the problems that they faced, and carrying through with legal measures to get the compensation that they deserve. But I wonder if there's the opposite aspect of that is missing, and I'm wondering whether the National Center is looking in terms of research into providing means by which the non-Indigenous people who occupy these lands can get a better understanding of the spirituality and the culture and the philosophy of an Indigenous people? Because I may have missed a whole lot of them, but I'm only aware of one that gives a fairly good coverage of that.
Very good question. When it comes to the educational content we provide, it really is kind of focused on the residential school experience and the residential school records, because that's our holdings within that. So I often advise organizations looking for that information that we're one part of the pie. For treaty-based education, I always recommend the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, for instance, for their expertise on treaties. And I also recommend other organizations when they're looking for that specific education on the local Indigenous peoples, the cultures and communities within the surrounding area. And when, as mentioned, this as a national organization, we deal with so many different, and so of course, I know a little bit of Manitoba, but I definitely don't know as much as I should for, the BC and the great number of First Nations communities and languages located there, to the Mi'kmaq and those represented in the Atlantic, to our northern relatives as well. So you're right to say there's not a lot of education that has been out there to date. We're seeing greater progress in sharing that information and accessing that information. So if you are looking for some recommendations on resources, I have a 73-page PowerPoint deck that's dedicated for that. I will say it is a little overwhelming, but if you have specific interests in some of those areas, like getting information on the local culture or groups on who you can connect with, or for instance, human rights and Indigenous rights, or podcasts or films or training organizations or programs, I'm more than happy to direct. We may not have the information at our center, but I can at least point you in a direction where you can find that information. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Can you speak a little bit more about the unrecognized schools and how the URSA can be considered to be even partially complete without those schools, and how big that attendance or the size of that is?
Very good question. Meaning, how did they determine what schools were going to be recognized versus which schools would be unrecognized? And that is related because it was a class action lawsuit against the federal government. So they had to show, and they being those putting forward the names of that school, that there was federal involvement in some way in the operation of the school, in the funding of the school, in its management or its care, for instance, of the children. If they could not find any hints, documents that talked about that federal government involvement, that school was not added to the list. It was part of Article 12. You had to fulfill two components, that federal government component, and then the second one was it had to be an institution for education purposes. So for instance, the Charles Camsell Hospital would not be included, although it did provide education for the patients that was in their care. Because it was not an educational institution, because it was a hospital, it was not added. And so, as I mentioned, there are a great number of institutions not added. And the top three reasons were there wasn't enough information to even make a decision, that it was solely run by a religious institution, that it was solely run by a provincial or territorial government, or that it was a federal day school, and of course that has its own settlement agreement there. So if they couldn't find that component, it wouldn't be included. And that's why there are two settlement agreements. The one I referred to earlier, the URSA agreement, and then a separate agreement for Newfoundland and Labrador. Originally, because those schools were opened in 1949, once Newfoundland and Labrador were added to Canada, they were kind of excluded. They couldn't find that federal government involvement. Well, lo and behold, they supported the National Moravian Mission and the International Grenfell Association to support those schools. And so if you take a look at the start and end date of the Newfoundland and Labrador schools, well, that recognition starts in 1949. The last school to be added on the recognized list was added in 2019, so we're often asked, when was the year that the final residential school closed? It sort of depends, same like how many residential schools were there. You see the year 1996 most often used, and that's because that was based upon those original numbers. With that new school added in 2009, technically, it's then 1997 when the Kilovic Hall School in Nunavut closed. That was actually also the last one opened in Canada. Opened in 1985 and closed in 1997. There were some schools still open later than that, but they were no longer operating as residences. So students were attending classes but no longer living there. Thank you. I should say I'm going to pass it back to Government House, but if you have more questions, feel free to come speak to me during our little food and drink time.
Thank you so much. Well, you beat me to it. I was going to ask for another round of applause. She did a great job, didn't she? That was fantastic. We did go a little later than planned, perhaps, but again, I think the time was well spent, and I thank you for your patience on that. Kaila also did hint a little bit as to what's coming up next. We always want to leave you with a thought of what our next presentation is going to be. The next topic in the series is entitled Intergenerational Impacts and Ongoing Societal discrimination, pardon me, with the guest speaker, Kathy Pompeno. I hope I pronounced that name right. I apologize if I didn't. That will be on June 20th of this year, coming up shortly, so you could look for registration for that presentation, which will open up on June 6th at 10 a.m., so you can watch for that news release. We are going to go and have some light refreshments for those of you that can stay. We do encourage that you do stay. We are going to put a bit of a time limit on the evening, as we must. And given that we are a little late, we don't want to push things too far, but it's about 20 after 8 now, so we would keep Government House open for you till about 8:45. And thank you very much for helping us out with that. On behalf of Her Honor, the Honourable Anita Neville, I thank you for your attendance this evening, and I invite you at this time to make your way to the ballroom. Thank you and good evening.